Ahoy! It is pretty obvious to most players that the Greatsword needs some balance changes. There are very frequent complaints about the damage output as well as the sticking power of the weapon when it comes to PvP. In PvE, the damage output is pretty crazy as well. I have been playing the Greatsword very extensively, and I'm generally someone who spends a lot of time theory crafting for this game and trying to figure out the numbers. Pretty much since I got my hands on a Greatsword, I haven't let go of it. I'm using it both in PvP and PvE, and in every mode except Wars, because I'm not playing Wars at the moment. But in Wars, it's also much more difficult to even fit a Greatsword in. We'll get to that later. I've also used the Greatsword a lot, both in light and heavy armor. But while I'm a huge fan of the Greatsword, I am not blind to the balance issues. I absolutely think that the Greatsword needs certain nerfs. In this video, I'm hoping to provide you with a nuanced perspective on what exactly the Greatsword needs in order to feel more like a balanced weapon, both in terms of nerfs, but also some buffs, but we'll get to that. When it comes to balancing the Greatsword, there is one major problem. You may recall this post by the New World team from around the time the Greatsword came out, and you can see here that they had a very clear idea of where they wanted it to be in terms of balance. But I broke this post down in a video back then and showed that many of these things simply don't apply. Like, for example, it can actually chase better than the Great Axe due to the better sticking power from its light and heavy attacks. It has much higher DPS than the Great Axe, but at the same time the utility is extremely limited. Overall, there are multiple factors that allowed the Greatsword to be an extremely high damage weapon. Not only are there a ton of damage increasing perks in the skill tree, including the Onslaught stance itself, but on top of that the Greatsword also scales with dex and strength evenly, so that allows you to spec a lot of points into both attributes and massively increase your damage more so than with most other weapons. But in return, the Greatsword also has very few other things. While it has some CC, some staggers, a pole and a root, those are very short, very limited, they don't really impact a fight very much, and also are primarily single target focused and conditional. When it comes to mobility, the Greatsword has some options that we will discuss in more detail later. They have some pros and some cons for sure, but what generally stands out when it comes to mobility aren't the abilities. It is the fact that your weapon tracks enemies so well and follows them so closely that it's really easy to stick to an enemy once you have latched onto them. This essentially results in the following. At range, a Greatsword isn't really a problem, and especially if you have someone engaging from range while already using an ability, they even take more damage. But the moment the Greatsword gets close to you and connects their first hit, you are in massive trouble as a player. The Greatsword deals high damage, it has high sticking power, and the Greatsword's goal is to kill you as quickly as possible, so you don't get the time of the day to punish it for taking increased damage while playing aggressive. That also means that the biggest threat to the Greatsword is anything that can stop it in its tracks. Hard CC that prevents the Greatsword from attacking, especially if it's something that cannot be countered by Relentless Freedom, is a death sentence for the Greatsword. In more outlier playstyles like a heavy Bruiser Greatsword, you can kind of play around this and use Roaring Rupture's debuffs to then turn the tables in that moment and also switch into Defiance stance, but that is more of an outlier scenario and that's not how most people play the Greatsword at the moment. The big problem is that in most cases, that is really all the Greatsword does. It sticks to enemies and does high damage. If you nerf these aspects too hard, then the Greatsword very quickly doesn't really have a purpose anymore because other weapons do most other things better. If the Greatsword didn't do high damage, all you would have to do is just ignore it, because all of the right tree skills kind of focus around people being close to you and trying to box you. If no one's doing that, and you're not doing much damage, then who cares about you? So how could this be nerfed effectively? The first attempt that the New World devs made was nerfing Cross Execution, the last perk of Crosscut, to reduce the damage of the final strike, or the damage increase rather. That was a joke to anyone who has actually actively played the Greatsword, because most of us weren't even using Crosscut at that time anymore. And for a good reason. We did some direct damage comparisons in-game in a real scenario, testing the Greatsword, the hatchet, the spear and other weapons, and we will talk about that in a future video. If you want to see that, hit subscribe and click the bell so you get notified. But what I can tell you we found in our testing is that it actually makes absolutely no sense to even use Crosscut, because you get higher overall damage out of just using heavy attacks. And this is where one of the core problems of the Greatsword lies. The increased damage heavy attacks and Onslaught stance that also have twice as quick charge time, so you're spamming them a lot more often, and also apply a bleed if you have the unflinching blade perk. I think that is the first angle to nerf the Greatsword in a balanced way. Simply nerfing the damage output of the heavy attacks. Either make the heavy attacks slightly slower, which then would also mean that they're a bit harder to hit in PvP, or simply reduce the damage of any heavy attack that is done while in Onslaught stance. So make it still go faster, but maybe deal like, say, 75% of the damage that a normal heavy attack does. The exact numbers can obviously be tweaked here. Along with that, the unflinching blade passive could also be nerfed. This applies a dot that deals 5% weapon damage for 6 seconds, which is actually a lot of extra damage, especially because it can stack 5 times. This could especially be nerfed in the number of stacks that it can have. Because in PvP, this perk is usually not a big problem. The heavy initial hit is the big problem, but there aren't really gonna be many situations where somebody's able to put 5 heavy attacks on you either without dying themselves or without you dying in the process. On the other hand, in PvE with mobs in a tank, you can very consistently stack it, and this is a very major factor in the overall damage output. So if this was limited to 1 or 2 or 3 stacks, then it would significantly decrease the PvE damage output without cutting into the PvP damage too much. Another perk that could be looked at when it comes to heavy attacks is Heavy Blade, which specifically only increases the armor penetration of heavy attacks. I personally believe that this perk could be reworked entirely. I don't think it's necessary. I think the heavy attacks on the Greatsword are strong enough either way. It could also just be nerfed by 5%, but I think that's the worst approach, because then it would literally just be half as good as the first row skill on Warhammer Epitome of Bonk for no good reason. So I prefer it just being something entirely different. The next very important topic is tracking. Tracking on the Greatsword is strong. It is, in my opinion, the best tracking melee weapon in the game. But it's also not as far ahead of some other melee weapons as some people seem to think. Overall, the Greatsword tracking is fairly similar to the normal sword, the longsword. People just don't notice it as much because the longsword doesn't do nearly as much damage. By comparing the Greatswords and the longsword's tracking, then it looks like the Greatsword has slightly longer range on the first attack, and in addition to that, it also moves you closer to the target compared to the longsword. The second swing on the Greatsword again seems to have slightly better tracking, but what's very noticeable here is that when it tracks, it pulls you really close to the target. The third swing, however, may track slightly better on the Greatsword, but is actually extremely buggy. It seems that most of the time, if you're not connecting the first 2 swings and only have the third swing coming out, you will track to the target, but the damage of the attack will actually ghost. This doesn't happen with the third swing of the longsword. So my suggestion is simple. Make the Greatsword tracking match the longsword tracking more. Keep the tracking that it has on the first attack, nerf the tracking on the second attack, but make sure that the third attack doesn't ghost constantly, and then make the Greatsword pull you less towards the target on both light and heavy attacks. In order to keep the Greatsword somewhat unique, make sure that it has a bit of a wider cleave compared to the longsword. This shouldn't be a balanced problem because the issues with the Greatsword tracking are on a single target, not in groups. Changing the tracking to closely match the longsword would allow the Greatsword to still be effective at sticking to enemies without feeling overwhelming at the same time. It would still be able to do its job of being a threat at close range if somebody gets to you with the Greatsword, but also not overwhelming or oppressive compared to any other weapon. Because if at that point it still felt too strong, it would be a damage issue, not a tracking issue, unless the sword suddenly feels too strong as well. Now that we've talked about the damage and the tracking of the basic attacks, let's talk about the abilities. The first one, Crosscut, is just a riddle to me. I think the devs just made this ability and said that it feels cool to use, because it swings cool and then it does big numbers, and that was it. Because there's not really anything that stands out about it in terms of functionality. It just does high damage and gives you grit temporarily, which heavy attacks do anyways. Maybe if the heavy attack damage is drastically nerfed, it would find a little bit of extra value, but generally speaking, I think this ability needs something more in order to be useful. One thing that definitely needs to happen is that when you use the ability and cancel it before the last hit, it should still put you into Onslaught stance. Sometimes you just need to dodge attacks during the animation, and this would also give it a purpose in PvP just to put you into Onslaught stance to get other effects. So of all abilities, this is definitely the one that needs the most work. Relentless Rush is in my opinion the strongest ability on the Greatsword. The dash isn't exactly the longest range, but the fact that you can get out of multiple enemies because it can't be body blocked, and Relentless Freedom as a perk on top of it just makes it very effective. It has a slow with it, and it has high damage, so if someone's running away from you and you can connect both hits, this actually deals pretty massive damage. I honestly think that if you're targeting any ability for a damage nerf, it's Relentless Rush. At the moment, due to the quick animation, the damage is so high that it's even effective to use it in PvE purely for damage on mobs. So I believe the percentage damage numbers here could be scaled down to 100% weapon damage, maybe even 90%, just to make it not as overwhelming in terms of damage output as a single ability. However, if we're doing that, the Adaptive Rush perk also needs a good look at it. Because like I said, the weapon primarily revolves around high damage at the moment. If it doesn't deal this high damage, it needs something else to be useful, so adding some more utility could be a great way to do that. At the moment, the route from Adaptive Rush only applies in Onslaught stance. The problem with that is that you have to get into Onslaught stance first somehow, and typically your gap closer would be Relentless Rush. This puts you in a situation where if you want this route, you either need to open with a heavy attack or Skyward Slash to even get into Onslaught stance, and probably use a gap closer from a different weapon to even close the distance, when effectively it would make sense that you dash at the enemy with Relentless Rush and then just briefly root them. One option would be to simply remove the condition of Onslaught stance for Adaptive Rush specifically, and only give it the extra healing in Defiance stance. An alternative option would be to keep the Onslaught stance condition, but since you are executing something that is relatively difficult to do in order to achieve this, you then get rewarded with a longer route. So this could be a 2 seconds route instead. As it stands, this perk seems so cool but feels so ineffective because by the time the animation of your rush has finished, this 1 second is almost over anyways. Either by removing the Onslaught condition or by increasing the duration, you also increase the utility of this ability in wars in particular, where the weapon desperately needs some help. Mind you, using Relentless Rush aggressively to root multiple players would still not come without risk, because you're losing your main escape tool and you're also in Onslaught stance, so you're taking more damage after, so this can be punished. And of course, we also need to talk about Skyward Slash. Skyward Slash is funny because the first hit of the animation actually doesn't have a particularly great tracking, but then the second part, the Skyfall Sword, actually tracks people through dodges. At the same time, in PvE, the second hit is so slow and clunky that it's not even worth speccing in. I don't really know what the design idea with Skyward is. I could suggest giving the first hit more tracking, but then the second part of the hit significantly less tracking, but maybe there is some design philosophy here where they want you to be really close for the first hit or something, I'm not sure. Either way, what I find extremely obnoxious about the ability is the upgrade perk Sickening Slash. So this turns your second hit from a single target into an AoE, fair enough. But the weird part is that the disease effect it applies is only on the first hit and not on the AoE, so it's on the single target Skyward Slash effect. Simultaneously, it's only a 20% disease, which pales in comparison to the 30% AoE that Infected Throw can apply. Even Putrefying Scream when slotted on armor still applies 29%. There are multiple options to solve this. One option would be to make the anti-heal apply to the AoE instead. If the slam was the thing that applies the anti-heal, then it would again get much more utility in wars, and then it would be justifiable that it's just a 20% anti-heal, because it is AoE after all. It would also feel more logical with the third perk just generally enhancing the slam component. Alternatively, the skill tree could be switched around a little bit. The first additional perk that is currently Skyfall Sword could instead become a single target anti-heal effect that is added to Skyward Slash, and then the second upgrade could just be Skyfall Sword and immediately apply the AoE damage component to it. Another option would be to take the Skyward Nullification perk, the armor and weapon perk that you can use, and put that on the third point of Sickening Slash instead, and then move the anti-heal effect of Sickening Slash onto the Skyward Nullification perk instead, so in order to get anti-heal, you now have to get the extra charm, and you can get more anti-heal if you put it on your weapon. I honestly think that would work quite well and also give the craft mod more value. No matter which approach is chosen here, any of them would make the whole skill a little bit less clunky. And since we are in the Onslaught tree still, I also briefly want to mention that Unrelenting Onslaught is kind of weird. It is very effective when used on charged heavy attacks, but a 2% reduction of cooldowns on light attacks is not very much. It's less than what you would get from refreshing moves. I get that heavy attacks are a lot harder to hit, but the disparity between light attacks and heavy attacks feels pretty big here. When it comes to the Defiance tree abilities, I don't have as many notes. I think Calamity Counter is doing what it's supposed to do. I do think it could have a little bit more extra damage if people hit into it a lot, so they get punished for it more. But overall, it's not an ability I use much, but I think it has its purpose. The only perk that feels a little bit underwhelming is the third perk, Critical Calamity, but that's mainly because most builds don't run multiple Defiance stance abilities. Steadfast Strike is definitely towards the higher damaging end, but since I already suggested multiple other nerfs to the damage, I think nerfing this in addition to that might be a bit overkill. Maybe if other abilities aren't nerfed as much and the attacks aren't nerfed as much, then the secondary hit damage of Steadfast Strike could be decreased. The only ability in Defiance stance that I think deserves more is Roaring Rupture. It is essentially a decent ability. It gives you a little bit of Fortify, it gives you some slows on enemies if you have the perk for it, and then it has the potential to also pull or weaken. My problem with it is that compared to other abilities like Shockwave, it simply feels underwhelming. You need to invest so many points into this ability to get a reasonable amount of beneficial effects, and it has a slow animation, whereas other abilities just start out much better and then the additional effects give you more of a bonus. The pull effect on this ability also feels extremely short in range and also unreliable, though that may be because the pull is often simply countered by grit. You're usually using this against enemies in melee range who happen to often melee attack and get grit, and then they can simply ignore that. Yes, the Greatsword is not a utility heavy weapon, but this particular ability is utility focused, so I don't see why it could not have a little bit more of that. Generally speaking, the Defiance tree has a bunch of weird perks surrounding blocks, very short and negligible damage reductions and so on, but we know that an overhaul to blocking is coming soon. So maybe this skill tree was already designed with that in mind and will make more sense once the blocking changes are there. I'll wait until that happens, and if that doesn't benefit this tree, then I can discuss it again in further detail. Overall, there are definitely very questionable and weird perks here, including the capstone perk. I also dislike the guarded shift perk that literally just requires you to stand around and block for 2 seconds, but I also don't really have an ideal suggestion on how to solve that without making it much harder to get Defiance Sands. All that said, I do believe that the concerns with the Greatsword are sometimes somewhat overstated. I'm seeing less and less people actually running Greatswords because more and more people are figuring out ways to counter the Greatsword effectively. Countering the Greatsword is something I'll talk about in a future video. If you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. While I made a lot of suggestions in this video, I imagine only a fraction of them would already lead to a more balanced weapon overall, and after that people may already feel like there aren't many further nerfs needed. At that point I'm hoping we can look at some of the buffs I suggested, because I think there are certain aspects of the Greatsword that at the moment are fairly clunky and could definitely feel much better. If you'd like to learn more about the Greatsword, I'll link my beginner guide and advanced PvE guide right here. An advanced PvP guide is also coming soon. I'm just waiting for the next patch to drop to make sure I have the most up-to-date info in that. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.